Well, today we're looking at the OM Systems OM-1 Mark II. We're going to look at the pros and cons of this camera and what I've thought about it, about using it for the last month here in Alaska. So let's talk about it. Well, the first thing I want to talk about is a big thank you to OM Systems for sending me out this camera. Nicole from OM Systems, the person I've been talking to and working with on this camera, has been fantastic. And all the engineers she's put me in contact with to answer all my questions and to tell me how to use this camera and how it works and how its systems work, they've been just great. So big thank you out to OM Systems for sending me out this camera and all the support they've given me while I've been testing this guy out. The next thing, I didn't have any expectations on this camera. Zero, no expectations. I didn't research this camera before I got it, didn't really look at any videos about it, nothing. I just really want to have a really blank slate before I got hold of this camera. And it's something I wanted to look at for a really long time. So now we're going to get into what this camera is. And again, this is my experience using this camera over the last month here in Alaska. So remember that. This is how I shoot what I need out of a camera and what I found using this camera. Your mileage may vary when you use this camera because you may have a different need within wildlife photography. But if you watch any of my videos, you know kind of how I shoot and what I need out of a camera. So let's talk about this camera a little bit more. So this is a 20.4 megapixel sensor camera. It is a backside illuminated stacked sensor camera with the 8 millisecond readout speed, which is pretty fast. Now, you're going to still see a touch of rolling shutter, but that's going to be in extreme situations, maybe a hummingbird wing when it changes its direction, things like that. But for the most part, you shouldn't have any problem with a rolling shutter. So what is a micro four thirds sensor and why is it valuable or desirable in wildlife photography? And what are the pros and cons of that? So the first benefit of a crop sensor is cost mainly. So that's one of the big reasons why we do crop, besides just getting in, tighter on our subjects or enlarging them in the screen, is cost, because it costs less to make that smaller sensor off the big sensor. And this sensor, like it says, 20.4 megapixels. If it was a full frame sensor, it'd be 51 megapixels full frame. But by making it smaller, less technology, less parts, all those type things, you make it a lot smaller. And you can also make the cameras smaller and lighter because you have a smaller sensor in them, which is really, really nice. That's where that cost comes down. And also the lens, when you're doing APS-C, which is a crop type lens, you can have smaller holes, openings, a lot lighter equipment and things like that. So that's where they can drop the price of those lenses. Because like this lens is $150 to $400 at 4.5. But since this is APS-C, smaller components and pieces inside here, lighter, then this guy runs at $7,500. This is a very expensive lens for lenses, but if it was a full frame, it'd be much more expensive. Same with the camera body. This thing is packed with tons of features, stacked sensor, all those things. And it comes in at $2,400, much cheaper than if it was a full frame camera. It'd probably be $4,000 to $5,000 very easily, just because of the larger components that have to go in it for a full frame sensor. So the second consideration for why it's desirable is weight. Smaller sensors, smaller camera bodies, smaller components for the lens and the body means less weight. This body comes in at 1.3 pounds. That's all it weighs, which is really nice. It is a light body. The lens comes in at 4.4 pounds, which is about the same weight as the 180-600 and the 200-800 from Canon, but it is a much longer reach with this crop on that, and it's 4.5 on its aperture. So again, the smaller that aperture, the more wide open that is, the heavier your lens usually gets. But this guy, since it's in the crop sensor, the APS-C format, it can knock that weight down. So it makes it where this rig runs me around 6.5 pounds, is really nice compared to a lot of rigs I run around for the same type of focal range. It may run me anywhere from 8 pounds to 11 pounds really in a full frame equivalent. So that's another reason, is weight. And the final desirable element of a crop sensor camera on a micro four thirds, that is image magnification. I'm not going to call it reach anymore, because when we talk, a lot of people talk about more reach. But once you get past 75 yards, no matter how large your animal is, even a bear, you're going to start losing detail in that animal just due to atmospheric conditions. There's no way to get around it. It's just the way the cookie crumbles. The farther an image is, the more atmosphere between you and more you're going to start to degrade the image as far as detail on that animal. Now, if you get a super large megapixel camera, maybe you can get a little more out of it, but really past 75 yards, things start to get much. That's why I'm going to call it magnification as far as reach, because the whole point of using a crop sensor or a teleconverter is to enlarge that subject in the screen. Instead of it being small like this, we want it larger, more megapixels on subject. That's what we're looking for. We talk about that a lot when I talk about cropping and things like that. You lose pixels on subjects. You want to keep those pixels on subject. And I have a seagull sneaking up on me, a juvenile, so if I keep looking this way, that's why. He's kind of funny to me. But that's the last one, is image magnification. This guy gives you 2 times image magnification. So those 3 factors, weight, cost, and image magnification, are the biggest reasons why people want to use a 4/3 or a crop sensor camera. Now, what are those cons? There's several cons you have to really know about this type of camera or any type of crop camera. The number 1 drawback is light gathering capabilities. So on a 2x crop camera, you have a 4 times reduction in the amount of light gathering you get, which is about a 2-stop drawback in light. So that's going to reduce your light by 2 full stops. Now, there's a caveat to that. With this camera, with the stack sensor backside illuminated, it's going to kind of cut into that 2 times. So it may be somewhere 1.5 to 1.8, somewhere in there as far as light gathering, but it's really a 2-stop reduction in light. So what does that relate to as far as ISO, if you think of it that way? So if you're shooting ISO 800 on this camera, it's going to be close to equivalent, in theory, of 3200 ISO. If you're shooting 1600, that's going to be 6400 ISO. If you're shooting 3200, that's going to be 12,800 ISO equivalent. Now, again, this BSI sensor, backside illuminated, is going to cut into that a little bit. So, but just remember, you're going to lose about 2 stops of light with the crop sensor camera. So keep that in mind. Now, aperture, that's the other one you got to think about. So you're basically going to have your aperture on your effective focal range. So what does that mean? Well, this lens goes out to 400 millimeters. So its effective focal range with the crop is 800 millimeters. So it's not 4.5 at 800, it's 4.5 at 400. So you got to remember that. So you really got to double that aperture. So just do your calculations at 400 as opposed to 800. It's much easier than saying I'm now at f8 sitting at, or f9, excuse me, with this lens at 800. So just, if you do those calculations at 400, you're going to get your depth of field. So what is that roughly at 400 for depth of field at 4.5? So I got some numbers written over here. Let me look at them and tell you what they would be. So if you have your subject sitting at 45 feet from you, and you're at 400 millimeters of this lens, which is effective 800 millimeters, and your aperture is at 4.5, your depth of field on that is going to be about 6 inches. Not bad, really. But if you had a full frame camera and you're shooting 800 millimeters at 4.5, same distance, 45 feet, it's going to be under 3 inches. So you're going from that far to that far. So it's a big difference as far as your fall off, especially if you're shooting something like right here where you've got logs closer behind it. So you could have a subject that's only a couple feet from this log, and this will start to blur out with a full frame. But with the crop sensor, you may see more detail of that. Now, that's not good or bad. It doesn't matter really. It depends on how you want to shoot. But you got to remember, your depth of field is going to be much wider with this camera versus a full frame camera. So an example is these shots here of this gull. This gull is about 75 feet from me, and I'm shooting this camera at 4.5, shooting out there at 250 millimeters to give me 500 millimeters effective focal range. And you can see here, this is what the shot looks like. Now, I swap out, I grab the Z9. Yes, it's more megapixels, but we're not worried about it. We're worried about the bokeh, right? So I'm shooting 500 millimeters, 4.5, exact same bird, exact same spot, 75 feet from me, right below me. And this is what the bokeh in the background, the foreground look like. So you'll see really quick, as we compare these two images, you'll see the bokeh balls are much bigger, softer on the full frame equivalent versus the smaller, tighter with the crop sensor camera. And you also notice the amount of fall off within the bird from its feet and its beak and its body on the two, as far as how close that depth of field is between the two cameras and how quick the fall off is. So it's not just how close the depth of field is, it's how quick the fall off is on both sides of that focal plane. So that's how you get those bigger bokeh balls and softer backgrounds, things like that. So that's the main difference as far as aperture goes on these two cameras. Again, Neither one of them's right, neither one of them's wrong. Depends on what you want out of your image. If you like these type of backgrounds where you see more of the background, then you can get that easier with these crop sensor cameras than you can with the full frame camera. If I'm shooting my f4 or shooting a 2.8 lens, it takes a lot more to get a farther depth of field. I have to back away from the animal, things like that, to maybe get the background more with the animal in it, things like that. But if I really want the blur, I don't have to encroach on the animal as far to get those really crazy bokeh balls and fall offs on them. But that's that part. So those are basically the pros and cons of using a Micro Four Thirds camera in theory. Now let's see how this guy does. We did give one example there with that gull as far as the aperture, but we'll look at the rest of it here in a little bit. So the next thing I want to talk about is image stabilization of this camera. It is fantastic. The image stabilization on this guy is really, really good. You can really see it when you hit that shutter, when you half press it down, you'll really see clunk, that thing lock in, especially in video. You'll see it you'll kind of have a little move and you hit it down and that thing will just stop. It's really crazy how it stops that thing. Now, is it the best stabilization as far as Canon, Nikon, Sony versus this? No, I think it beats the Canon and Sony and as far as stabilization go, which is the base stabilization video. But the Nikon, something about the new Z and those lenses really lock in stabilization as far as hand holding. This one does a fantastic job. It's right there with it, but I still think the Nikon edges it out just a little bit, but really fantastic. You won't be upset about the image stabilization on this camera with this lens. It's really, really good. And that stabilization is what they claim is 8.5 stops. And I do believe it. I believe it's 8.5 stops. Really, really good. And has an IP53 rating as far as weather sealing goes, which means it's not, your Z9, R1 type things, R3 weather sealing, but it's still really good weather sealing for IP53, that is. On to the LCD on this camera. It's really cool. It does have a flippy screen, which is really nice. So it's really good if you need to film yourself or flip it around to see something, especially I was doing some shots low in the water with some sea lions we'll talk about and I'll show you in a little bit, but it's really nice. Just put that down, look at that screen on the back, really nice. The LCD, nothing spectacular on LCD. It looks about like any other LCD as far as brightness, things like that. I could get it bright enough in a cloudy day or a sunny day to really see the LCD quite well, at least as far as you can for an LCD. Now to the EVF. This is the one that kind of gave me the most pause with this camera, and it could just be a me thing, but let me talk about it. The EVF is 5.7 million dot EVF, plenty of resolution, better than some other cameras out there. 120 megahertz refresh rate, really great for fast action shots. Tons of ability to raise the brightness level and lower it and all those things, contrast, all those things work quite well. I could get all that working. I could see my subject in the screen. I could see all the information. There's tons of information you can add in this screen everywhere. Not a problem there. Where was my problem? Well, it was something really weird. And again, it could just be me. If I had a bird that had white in it, a seagull, an eagle, things like that, anything that had white in it, a lot of white that I need really exposed for, I had the hardest time trying to see that exposure when I would set my exposure in the window, looking through the EVF, looking at that animal to try to determine did I have proper exposure. I could look at my not my EVF, but my histogram there, and I could look to see if it's blowing out. But if it's an eagle with mostly dark, a little bit of white, you really can't tell where that blowout is unless you just see a little spike in the far right or something hitting the side. But it would look like I was way underexposed. When I would roll it maybe just one touch, a third of a stop or 2/3 of a stop up to bring the exposure up, then all of a sudden it was the opposite. It looked like I was blowing the head out. It was just so bright and just, it's no detail to it. And I couldn't really find that happy ground as far as the white with the contrast looking through the EVF. Like I said, it could just be me, but it was the entire time I used the camera, where I was in cloudy days like today, or I was in a really bright day like other day. When I was shooting this camera over the last month, I had a real hard time with any bird that had white in it. So that part really hindered my shooting. Now, when I got the pictures, looked at the pictures, I didn't see that issue as far as the pictures go. I didn't see a whole lot of blown out birds when I was looking at it, but I was really struggling to find that exposure for birds with white in it. So that was my biggest drawback as far as the EVF goes. Everything else looked great inside that EVF. It has blackout free shooting also, which is really nice. When you're in the high speed, you don't see the the flicker in there. It just straight looks like a movie, so that's really nice. But that was my biggest hindrance as far as the EVF goes. Another really cool feature on this camera, it has built-in live neutral density filters in it and graduated filters. I didn't mess with the graduated filters very much because I don't do landscapes very often, but I can see how that would come in handy by using the live ND filters. I don't really use live ND filters as far as my stills go because I just bump my shutter speed up if it's too bright. But when I'm in video, I can't bump my shutter speed and I can't bump my aperture anymore. All I can really bump is my ISO. When I'm already down to the lowest part of ISO, I'm stuck. So by kicking those live NDs on, I was able to bring that exposure down on a bright day to get the proper exposure for video. Really, really nice, because with this camera, when you're shooting video, you're shooting log. You're not shooting natural covers out of this camera for the type of resolutions I want to shoot on this guy to make video. And being able to get that proper exposure is very, very, very important when you're shooting log. If you get your log settings off too high, too low, the pictures don't look real good when you pull your video off of it later. So having live ND in this guy for your video shooter is really, really nice. Now let's move on to the buttons, handling, and all that kind of stuff, menu layout. I usually cover this early in the video. I wanted to cover it later in the video just because of a couple of reasons. And I've got a couple seagulls and an eagle behind me that are just barking at each other. So if it gets a little loud, that's why. They're literally right behind me. We've got a lot of pink salmon and a few silvers coming in here into the bay where I'm at. So they're all getting a little frisky right now and getting a little loud and a little fighty. So if you hear a lot of noise, that's what's going on. The back of the handling and everything on this camera. The handling on this camera is really nice. This being at 6.6 pounds for a really large rig to get up to 1,000 millimeters makes it pretty nice in the hand as far as lightness goes. We're gonna fight with these guys all day long, sorry about that. And the buttons themselves are all in the right place. The shutter, the aperture, where I've got them set up, they're all pretty much where I expect it. And the shutter button, everything's real easy to get to, and I don't have to get my eye out of the EVF. For the most part, we're going to talk about one thing here in a minute that is bad about it, but for the most part, it handles and feels really good in the hand, and that's really what you want, something that feels good. The grip feels good, plenty of room in here for your fingers between the lens, both ways with this grip, because I got them to send me the grip also. I like cameras with grips. Most of you guys may not, so this is a touch heavier. This is closer to 7 pounds now with this grip and the extra battery, but that's still really, really good. So what is the negative on this guy as far as the buttons, menu, and layout? Well, there's no way to assign 2 focus buttons to this camera. 2 different focus methods, that is. So on all cameras, these modern cameras with the subject detection, the modern mirrorless cameras, is I want an auto area AF and I want a single point. There's no way to set 2 buttons up on this guy. You can only set 1 button up for 1 focus method and subject detection. That's it. You can't do 2. It won't work. So to get the 2 buttons to work, like what I like to do auto area where I can find the bird in flight. Got a crow flying in front of me, that's why I'm kind of pointing that way. It'll lock that bird up and stay with him. But if you're in a busy thing like these trees or something like that's more busy, the autofocus gets lost. In that case, I want a single point where I can go tell it where I want the focus point to go to, and then, or focus through something, like you got brush. You want to focus through that brush, you want to focus on something behind it to get past the brush. Now you can see your fox or your bird, you hit the auto detect or subject detect, and it will grab that bird through the brush. This camera, I cannot do the 2 buttons. Doesn't work. So the only way to make it work for going back and forth is you set up, like I've got the buttons set up right now for auto area, subject detect to find the animal. If I need a single point, I have to hit another button, turns the subject detection off, then another button that changes it from auto area to single point. Then I can use it. Now to get back to subject detect, I got to click those 2 buttons again to get back to it. So it's a longer process to go back and forth. And if you've watched my videos, you know me, I'm going single point, auto area, like back and forth constantly. I'm just back and forth with them to get my lock and get that thing. That's why I'm on lock on subject a lot faster when I have that type of method than I was if I have a method like this is. So that part right there to me is a major drawback for me on this camera, to be able to hit things really fast and keep them in focus. So that is a drawback as far as the menus and the buttons. Now once they get that set up working, because I did bring it to the engineers, that's what I saw and asked about that. If they ever get that in here, that's going to make this camera even better than it is already. It's really a good camera, but once they get that, get those 2 subjects, those focus methods in there, It's going to make an incredible camera for this guy real quick. So now let's talk about frames per second this camera shoots, and that's where it gets really fun with this guy. It shoots at 120 frames per second, up to 120 frames per second. It also has what they call ProCapture, which is a pre-capture prior to hitting the shutter. Hold it down halfway, it's going to buffer some shots, and then you can hit that button and capture shots after that. So you get things prior, which is really, really nice. Now, Nikon, Sony, and Canon all have this feature. Right now, the only one that's on the market today is Sony's A9 III that kind of, to me, gets it right. Kind of like this does. It's part of the camera roll, doesn't matter, and it's in RAW. Nikon is in JPEG, Canon's in RAW, but it's in its own little buffered silo. Kind of a pain in the butt to get out, so I don't use it on any of those cameras. Now, the A9 III, I use it a lot, and I loved it. This guy, I use it all the time. Once I got it set, I leave it. Now you can control that from 120 frames down all the way down just a couple frames. I set this at 15 frames a second before 15 frames before the shot, that is, of what I'm shooting. So I was always getting 15 frames prior to when I hit the button, which is really nice. So once you start using that, you'll always use that. So it's just a great, great feature. So they did really good with the ProCapture on this camera. It works really, really nice. And that leads us to the buffer on this camera. The buffer on this camera is fantastic. It worked really well. Most of the times I was shooting this guy at 25 frames a second. That's really between 20 and 30 is where I really find the sweet spot. If you did have some blast off birds or things like that, maybe you want to shoot 120 frames a second, but most of the time I shot 25 frames a second, and the buffer, I never overran the buffer when I was shooting just normal real world situations. Now, what will happen from time to time is when you go from stills to video, or you go to turn the camera off, things like that, and you fired off a bunch of shots with the stills, or you're shooting video, it'll take a second, say, waiting before it'll go to the other functionality. So you got to wait for that thing. The buffer's working great, but it's still got to clear that off to the card before it'll let you switch. So there is that, but it didn't really hinder me with what I was shooting that day, because the buffer kept up, which is really, really good. Now, for the cons in frames per second for this camera, there's always cons somewhere, trust me. And again, this is more of a me thing. And this is a thing that also I hated with the R5, and it's high speed. So when you get this guy in high speed, you want to shoot above 20 frames a second or things like that, the 120 or all those, you can only shoot in full silent. There's no option to add sound to your shutter. That's why with the Canon R5, I shot in first curtain, so I had a tactile sound. I have to have tactile sound. I need to know when I hit that shutter button and when I'm releasing that shutter button to kind of know when I'm capturing action. Now I used this and it was fine with it, but I was always guessing how many shots. So when I would look and review, I was always surprised by how many shots I did or did not get. Several times I thought, oh, I got that part of action, but I didn't because I wasn't pushing the button down the whole way, and I didn't hear that tactile shutter sound going off. So this not having shutter sounds and those higher speed rates, just like the Canon R5, I don't use it. I remembered why I did not use 20 frames a second full electronic on the Canon R5. I always used the first curtain, so I had sound. So not having sound on there, to me, is a big detriment to the way I shoot. So that was a big con for me on this camera. But again, ticky-tacky things. I was still able to use it, still able to get shots, but I'd have preferred it having that sound. Let's talk about ISO and low light shooting. So we talked earlier about how with a crop sensor camera, you do have two stop difference in light as far as what you're going to have versus a full frame. And it's not as severe as 2x, but it's not as less severe as a 1.5 or 1.6 camera. It's somewhere in between there. When I was shooting hummingbirds, I could really tell at the loss of detail on that bird in the frame, because the bird was okay in the frame, not huge in the frame. And one thing you got is this 20 megapixels. So if you go to crop, you'll start to see that loss a little bit in quality. But once you start introducing a bunch of noise in there, and I don't remember what I was shooting, 1600, 3200. I'll have the images up here, kind of show you what I'm talking about. You could see in the belly of this bird where the feathers were, since the noise was in there, you didn't have the amount of detail in those feathers that you'd hope to get, you know, with the camera with the better ISO performance in it. And it's not horrible, because this con actually can be fixed a little bit, so it's not so much of a con, and that is all the new software used for pre-processing or post-processing. Topaz, DxO. I use DxO. I don't use Topaz unless maybe I have a crazy motion blur thing that I just have to recover, or gigapixel to upscale. but I use DxO to get the camera profile, a little bit of noise, and a little bit of sharpening. But running this camera through DxO Pure Raw to get the camera profile, the noise, and the sharpening really was a dramatic increase in the quality of these images, which I believe if you use this camera, you need to use DxO. And if you don't use DxO, use this camera, go try it out. There's a 30-day trial out there. I don't make any money off DxO. Just go try it out, see what you think of it. But to me, it was a dramatic difference on these images, and I'll show you this hummingbird before and after when I processed it through the DxO. It looks so much better. Now, the megapixel of the camera plus the light, you can see, and I'll pull up here, a hummingbird shot with the Z9 and a hummingbird shot with this. Now, it is a 45 versus 20, and it's also a lot better light gathering versus the other light gathering. But it should give you an example of what you'll see as far as the image quality of the two images. I'm blowing them up the same size, not going crazy, because I could go really crazy with the 45 megapixel and get a lot tighter and get a lot more detail. But just that level, just show you the level of detail as far as just what the ISO does. Now, like I said, with DxO, you can shoot this guy in lower light. I did shoot some lower light stuff that was a lot lower. DxO recovered them quite well. The images were quite useful. So don't be afraid of this guy in low light, but just know you're gonna have to work on your images to get the color and get the sharpness and the noise and get all that taken care of with this camera. Now, the last thing about this camera I want to talk about is the autofocus performance of this guy. That's something that we're always really curious about on a different camera brand. And like I said, I had no expectation of this camera, zero whatsoever, before I got it. And the autofocus was pretty good, but the things I noticed about it was it had some drift to it with the autofocus. It locked them up pretty quick. If a bird was right out in the open, it would lock it up. But if I kept holding the button down, even with just one bird on there, it would at times try to go somewhere else. And the confirmation lock on that as it jumps to it, I'd expect another box to say, hey, I'm locked. And I don't see that as much on this guy. I'll see sometimes the focus method I'm in, either single point or all area, some little dots going on. But the white lockup box, when it locks it up, it's nice, but it just seems like it's like the subject detect box of the camera. So that part kind of threw me off a little bit. But I could see that the camera was focusing, went from out of focus to focus when it did it. It was very snappy when it hits autofocus. The motors on this guy is really good. So it works really well. Now, I'm nitpicking here. The focus locked up a lot on it. But what I noticed was drift. If you had anything busy with it or multiple animals, it really was really bad drift. What I compare it to for you guys that shoot Canon is the Canon R7. If you hold the button down, the autofocus button on this guy too long, just like the Canon R7, it's going to find something else. It's just down and determined. No, you need something else. That's what these two cameras do. This one to me was a little more aggressive with finding something else. Yes, I adjusted settings to make it not as jumpy or more jumpy, all those type of things. I tested all those type of settings. But I don't want to be changing my settings every time I go to a new type of subject where, you know, I couldn't really find one. I did set it a little less jumpy, you know, a little more towards 5 instead of moving it back towards the 1, which makes it more sticky. But it didn't seem to help as much as I thought it would. And Canon doesn't either. Neither one of them do as far as that jumping and staying on a subject to me. But you just got to remember that when you get a subject, you got it locked, get your finger off. That's a trick. You lock it, get your finger off. The bird's not moving in and out of that plane, get your finger off it. Now, if he's in flight, stay on him. So that's what I'll talk about next is bird in flight. So bird in flight locks a bird very well in the sky. But again, as you're panning with that bird, it invariably will drift and come back. Now it comes back pretty quick, but it will drift off of it. I've got shots here where bird focus, loses focus, comes back to focus. Very, very annoying, but it does happen time to time on all manufacturers, but this one happened more than I wanted it to, because when it really went out, it was really a weird way when it went out and the bird's tracking. What I noticed when things would go out, and we'll talk about video in a minute where this happens too, is when I'm panning left to right, I noticed I would get some pull off. Now, yes, it looks like there's some settings in here I found that should fix that, but again, I don't want to be changing constantly settings inside the camera. I want to stay inside the viewfinder. I want an 80-20 solution when I'm on the camera. If I'm going to be shooting only bird in flight and I'm having that, then yes, I could set that. But when I'm shooting birds, a lot of times I'm shooting them on the ground or on a stick, and then they'll fly off and I get the shot. I want something that does both. And with this guy, I could, but I had those drift problems with it. So the autofocus has drift. Just expect that. Don't think it's locked on. The Nikon bird and the Canon autofocus, as far as all the other cameras besides the R7, are much better than this, but this is still extremely good. I'm nitpicking. I'm saying versus those cameras. The A9 III, it was a little better than this. As far as A7R5, this is a lot better than the A7R5 autofocus to me, in my opinion. And as far as the A1, I think the A1 is a little better than this, but not quite. I think it holds lock better when like a bird in flight, for sure. As far as getting lost, same thing. It also will get a little lost when you're sitting on the water. All cameras do. This one at times worked really good across the water when you're real low with the water. Other times with the ocean, it got lost quite a bit and you have to reacquire your subject. So just know that about the AF. I thought, again, really good autofocus, but those are things I saw with autofocus. I don't think if you have this camera, you're going to be really upset by the autofocus, but if you're coming from one of the other camera manufacturers and used to using those, you'll notice that on this camera. But if you haven't, this thing's going to be great for you. Or you're coming from DSLR to this is going to be a game changer for autofocus, but it is a very snappy autofocus. Now let's talk about video for this camera. The video on this guy works really good. The video quality is great. You'll see in the last video and the clips I have in this one, as far as video, looks really good. Now, if you're shooting these more higher resolution codecs, 4K, things like that, you can only shoot in log. So you're gonna have to grade. But what was really cool about this camera, it was real easy to hand grade, because all this is hand graded. All the footage in the last video and this video, if I have video of animals, it's all hand graded. I just graded all that myself. Worked really well. It was really easy to grade. You have a lot of color you can pull in and out of this, which makes it really good, but you do have to color grade it. And it was all fantastic. When the autofocus is locked on, looks good. And that is our problem to me with this camera. The autofocus is good, but it drifts horribly at times. You can't, even though you hit the autofocus method to grab an animal in focus, don't do it. Let it do its thing. So what you have to do with this camera is you got to bring it up, you get your subject in it through the viewfinder, you get your bird in there. It may be out of focus, that's fine. Just hold for a second and that autofocus will go, oh, there it is, and it'll grab it, it'll stay on it. If you hit the autofocus button, like I say, it does get out of focus, hit it again, it tends to breathe or something, or the focus goes crazy and comes back, does some weird stuff. And so the best to be, if you lose autofocus on your subject, don't move the camera, just try to get your subject back in the center of the camera or somewhere, and don't move the camera, it'll go back. Now, this camera, when I would have a subject in focus and the bird starts to walk left, if I left it alone, it would stay in focus with that bird walking. But if I panned with it, almost every time it would lose focus, and then if I stopped again, it would grab it. It didn't really like, for me, how I had it set, to pan and keep an autofocus. So the autofocus in video drifts a lot with erratic subjects or things like that, with the continuous autofocus trying to stay on that subject. Now, when it locked, it looked good. When it locked, it was superb, and I had really good video. I was really happy when the video's in focus. I was really happy with the video that came out of this camera. Really happy. Okay, conclusion overall of this camera. Camera's fantastic. It's really good. We talked about the pros on it. You know, you've got your 2x crop, so you can enlarge that subject in the frame. It's going to be cheaper. It's going to be a lot lighter, especially get the other lens on this guy. It's going to get even lighter. All those things are fantastic. Shooting this lens was really nice because it does have a 1.25 teleconverter on it. I didn't really review the lens. You guys can look at that. If you want me to review it, tell me. I'll do a quick review on the lens, tell you what I thought about it. But the lens, just overall, I'll tell you right now, this lens is fantastic. 4.5, you know, all through that, and a crop factor, just fantastic. The ProCapture on this camera, fantastic. The image stabilization, excellent on this camera, just incredible. The images coming off this camera were beautiful images. I did some shooting down at the Sea Life Center, playing with the pup and some other birds. Beautiful images come off that. Tons of detail, tons of color. Now, the images are a little flatter on the raw than I'm used to, that I like, but I had tons of color I could pull back into that. That's the one thing about editing on this images come off this camera I thought was really nice. I had a lot of color information to work with. It seemed like the colors were a lot easier to enhance or de-enhance on this, in video especially, and in stills, so it was really nice that way. But like I said, I shot a lot of other things, hummingbirds, all these other things, but all these images looked great. I was really happy with the images that were coming off of this, and the videos coming off this guy. Just really good as far as his camera goes, because really what matters at the end of the day is what the images look like that you're pulling off the camera. But the cons on the camera, as far as I go, because I have to be honest about this on all cameras, is the EVF. I had problems getting that exposure with anything that had white in it. Any bird that had white, I had a problem getting the proper exposure set. Again, could be me. The other thing was the autofocus. The drift in the autofocus was a bit disconcerting at times. When I had the sea lions, you know, this actually would happen. They'd pop up out of the surf, they'd have a fish. And when I hit that autofocus and went to hit the images, it says I had lock, and it looked like it was focusing, and I'd hit the shutter, and I'd get back, look at my camera roll, and my first burst of images were out of focus, and then it was in focus. So that was a little disconcerting, and then of course the drift I get, and that will probably get better the more you use the camera. But after a month, because when I shot sea lions was the end of the month, and I'd been shooting a long time, so I was kind of used to that, but I was really surprised that I was still having some of those issues with me using that camera as far as that while I was in focus and my hit rate. The button layout, as far as not being able to have 2 buttons for your focus, that one was also disconcerting to me, because again, I want to be 80-20 in that viewfinder, 90-10 actually, that viewfinder, and not have to come off of it, and I want to move quickly between video, stills, types of focus methods, things like that. So not having the 2 buttons, not being able to quickly move from video to stills, I had to change that top button a little bit real quick. Those are things that kind of slowed me down. Now over time you'd probably get faster at it, figure ways around it, but for me, the way I shoot, those things kind of limited a little bit by keeping my eye in the viewfinder. But overall, the camera performed really well. I would say this is a really good camera. Yes, I had things to complain about it on it, but that's more of a me, how I shoot type thing. But I want you guys aware of the things that I ran into that were cons, but I also want you to know the good things about it. And if you look at the images, the video, just incredible. I think it did really well. And again, I'd like to say a big thanks out to OM Systems for sending this out and let me look at it. I really appreciate it, because I probably wouldn't have looked at this camera if it hadn't been for them sending me out. So Nicole, all your engineers, everybody at OM Systems, thank you very much, and I appreciate it. And guys, as always, until next time we talk, get outside and go run that shutter.